I'm the Dean of the Law School, and it's our great pleasure to host this event. At the law school here recently, we had an all-day symposium on the Affordable Care Act and have really been paying a lot of attention to healthcare issues of late. And so this is a wonderful opportunity for us to partner with the Statesman Journal on this all-important issues of and timely issue regarding vaccines. My only role here today, other than welcoming you, is to turn the microphone over to our moderator, Michael Davis, who's the editor of the Statesman Journal. And I'll say just a word or two about Michael. If we were to talk about his distinguished background for very long, we could use up all our time just on that. But what really stuck out to me about it was, out of all the things he's done, contributing to, as an editor and a journalist, to national magazines and newspapers, is all the work he's done regarding children. So, for example, he has a best-selling book, New York Times bestseller on the history of Sesame Street. He has been a contributor to Parents Magazine, and he spent a year of service working in Head Start programs. So I know this is an issue close to his heart. So thank you, and please join me in welcoming Michael Davis.
Thank you very much, Dean. Hi, everyone, and welcome. We did start on time, and we will end on time. We respect your time, and we thank you for being here tonight. And we thank Willamette University's College of Law for hosting us and making this possible. We also want to say hello to viewers watching us on CCTV. This evening's program will air on our local cable station, which is a great community resource that I hope you support. I've asked all of our panelists to share with me and you, as we introduce them, any memories that they might have of getting a vaccine or inoculation. And I'm old enough to remember the polio scare of the 1950s. I remember getting a polio shot, and I also remember getting the Sabin oral vaccine on a sugar cube, and all of my classmates lining up to get it. It's a memory that stayed with me all these years. The lay of the land tonight is I'm going to turn the moderating over to Seyram Yu, who I will introduce soon. We wanted to make sure that there would be lots and lots of time for questions, so there will be a full 30 minutes, at least a full 30 minutes, opportunities for you to ask your questions. Please, when you have that opportunity, be quick and concise. And if you launch into a speech, Imperial stormtroopers will come and pick you up and deposit you on Winter Street. So, in alphabetical order, meet Professor Steve Green. And he is Mr. Separation of Church and State. Right, sir? This has really been a passion all of your life, correct? All the way back to high school, if we could share this anecdote. On the morning announcements at your high school in Texas, they used to read Bible quotations, and this was long after it was ruled that was not to be. And one day you were asked to be on the announcements, and instead of quoting from the Bible, you quoted from the
Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu text.
Yes.
My father being a clergy person, he had in his library all other types of religious texts, and I just thought I'd make an example because it was more than a decade past the school prayer decisions of the early 60s. But of course, in many parts of the country, the practice still persisted, notwithstanding what the U.S. Supreme Court says. Mm-hmm. And so I went ahead and read from this alternative text, and the principal had mistakenly trusted me. And had actually left me in his office with the announcement with a PA system on. And so I can still remember him, a rather large guy, football coach, come tearing back into his room and grabbing the mic out of my hand and saying, "What are you doing? You can't do this." And so I started lecturing him about separation of church and state. And I ended up in detention hall for my anecdote.
Okay, thank you. Boy, it's great to have you here. This is the new executive director of the Willamette Heritage Center, Bob Reinhardt. And man, are we glad that you've taken the job another great community resource, isn't it? You are currently teaching at Western.
That's right.
And you have also taught here on the campus of Willamette
That's right.
University,
I'm a
right?
graduate of and former teacher of. Yeah.
And you have compiled an impressive academic record. And you told me that you were inoculated against chickenpox by virtue of having chickenpox.
Yeah. So I mean, like many, I think in this room, I was protected from chickenpox later by getting chickenpox when I was a kid. But I have no memories of vaccination myself. I have 2 kids, and so I'm very aware of vaccinations right now. I have a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, so I have more vivid memories of their vaccinations in the last few months.
Do you take
than my
them
own.
to the doctor?
My wife and I do, yeah. Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you, sir, are the doctor. You two are the doctor. So what is that like, by the way, or do you turn that over to the nurse, inoculating children?
We share the responsibilities.
You do?
The nurse probably does it more often than I do, but you know, as somebody who, you know, my entire career has been dedicated to protecting children, and then I do something that, you know, especially the first time the parents come in, it's, you know, kids cry. But, you know, after it doesn't take many times of seeing kids in the hospital, you know, with pneumonia, meningitis. I had a baby that died from whooping cough, and you know what? I'll take the brief crying 1,000,000 times over watching babies die from something preventable.
By the way, this is Dr. Jay Rosenblum. He has a name. And last but certainly not least, it's Senator Elizabeth Steiner Hayward. And you are both a senator and a doctor at the same time. And you have amassed another formidable academic record, and you've donated time to a clinic, and you have been a scout leader and a mom, and you have told me that one memory that you have dates back to when you were a 4-year-old, and let's take it from there. What happened?
So I was in a preschool, and there was a rubella or German measles outbreak, because this was before we had an immunization against rubella. And the vast majority of my classmates and I got it. And that wasn't, fortunately, we all did fairly well. Only 1 or 2 of us got really sick. But our teacher was pregnant, and she hadn't had rubella. And even at 4, I remember hearing my mother talking with other mothers about, was her baby going to be okay? Was her baby going to be okay? And unfortunately, her baby wasn't okay, because she got rubella in her first trimester of pregnancy, and her baby had birth defects as a result. And it's really, I mean, I'm 52. 48 years is a long time to have something stick with you. And that's not like my mom telling me the story. I don't think my mom even remembers it. So I've just stuck with me ever since.
Thank you for sharing that. And finally, Seiram Yu, the Statesman Journal. Seiram Yu is a horned frog, and curiously, that's not an insult. She is a graduate of Texas Christian University. She has just completed 4 years of service to the Statesman Journal. She is, in my estimation, one of the great young health reporters in these United States. And so I turn it over to you, Seiram Yu.
Thank you. That's a tremendous introduction, and I'm quite embarrassed. But so I'm just going to start and turn the attention to the panelists. And I wanted to, give everyone a chance to give a brief opening statement and answer the question of, from your vantage point, what most concerns you when thinking about the vaccine issue in Oregon and the immunization rates here. And I'll start with you, Steve.
Well, I teach constitutional law, and my specialty is religion and law, as you can tell. And I guess what I have been concerned about in watching some of the recent debate about this in Oregon and other states is many times there's a lot more heat than there is light to these issues. And what I mean by that is I've heard a fair amount of rhetoric, is often a pejorative word, but a fair amount of language that has been cast in this debate of kind of absolutes. And when it comes to the law, there are very few absolutes. There are no absolute rights. Just like the Second Amendment is not an absolute right. I don't want to get into another controversial topic.
Been there, done that this week.
The right to raise your children according to your own desires is not an absolute right. The Supreme Court has recognized that parents have certain rights when it comes to both the religious, educational, and otherwise just general upbringing of their children. But like any right, like freedom of speech, it is not absolute. It's a balancing that goes on. And so consequently, that's really what this discussion is all about. It's about how you go about balancing people's interest in rights. And in this particular area, courts have been rather clear, and I can go into a lot more detail a little bit later if you want, have been relatively clear that the state has rather significant interests when it comes to matters of public health, public safety. The state has responsibilities of parents patri, which is to look out for the best interest of children when it comes to instances where the parents potentially do not do the best thing for the children and can intervene in some instances to protect children. And so consequently, this is a difficult question, and it takes some kind of nuanced understanding of what the interests are at stake. But as much as anything, there's just no absolute claims that exist within this area.
Thank you.
So I think as a historian, I'm obligated to say something like we haven't learned the right lessons from the past. And I think that's actually true. I think that when we think about vaccination, I think that there are a lot more lessons from the past that we can learn, both in terms of the great triumphs of vaccination. My own specialty is in the history of the eradication of smallpox, which is just the most remarkable public health victory in human history in some ways. But also the history of opposition to vaccination. And there is a long and deep and complex history of opposition to vaccination. And I think it's too often simplified into sort of science versus anti-science or rationality versus anti-rationality. And I think when you look at the past, and I think you see this today as well, that the roots of anti-vaccinationism are very complex, and the people that are reticent about vaccination and the people that are adamantly opposed to vaccination come from, in many ways, very different backgrounds. And the thing that concerns me the most is I'd like to see more sophistication in terms of our understanding of the causes of anti-vaccination sentiment, as well as the reasons that people give for being opposed to vaccination. And those aren't always the same thing. The causes for anti-vaccination sentiment, for instance, they can run the gambit from the expansion of the state and opposition to that, sort of very deep cultural and social factors, compared to the reasons that people give, which is, they know somebody who they think got sick because of vaccination, right? And I think understanding those things, the causes and the reasons for anti-vaccination sentiment, I think would get us hopefully farther along in trying to have a productive conversation and making progress on this issue.
Thank you.
So as a pediatrician, I have the same concerns about the balance as those that are coming at it from a legal perspective, but for me, it's trying to make sure that we have enough of our population vaccinated so that we don't have the resurgence of these diseases. Measles was considered eradicated from this country. It was no longer endemic. That means that there were occasionally people who would come into the country with the disease, and there would be a number of cases. But we didn't see then spread to spread to spread. And if we have a high enough vaccination rate, the diseases won't spread. So if between 95 and 100% of people are vaccinated, you will eliminate the spread of the disease. And allowing for people's, personal, religious, allowing, not, I want to respect their right to choose. We have laws, we have systems in place. I am, within my practice, if a family says that they won't vaccinate, I don't tell them to leave. I say, okay, can we talk about that? Can I understand where you're coming from and why? But from a population perspective, when we're really teetering on that level of unvaccinated or undervaccinated in the community that we've started to see the resurgence of some of these diseases. And the diseases are horrible and sometimes deadly. And you know, it's always better to prevent than to try to treat the consequences of something that can cause brain damage or death. So it's trying to balance the family's rights and the family's wishes with keeping enough people protected so that we don't see the spread and we don't see these things come back.
So I have a background in human subjects protection. I was co-chair of the Institutional Review Board at OHSU for 4 years prior, another time in my life. And I've done graduate training in bioethics. And one of the interesting things that I thought about a lot during that period of time was the question of informed consent and risk assessment and how people understand risk in their day-to-day lives. It's really interesting because when you talk to a family, for example, about a research study that their child might be eligible to participate in, and you try to explain risk, research is really scary to people. And there's a man named Ezekiel Emanuel who's a very noted bioethicist and was head of the bioethics section of the NIH, and he came and gave a really fascinating talk a few years back, and he talked about certain kinds of studies, things like giving kids allergy injections or giving them a certain kind of, putting them in an MRI machine or something like that, as opposed to the risks of playing football in high school. And most parents are very scared about having their kid participate in a study that involves, I'll give you a really great example. There's something called body composition testing with a DEXA machine. It involves exposure to radiation. Now you hear that word and you get really scared, except that it turns out that you get more radiation on a cross-country flight by threefold than you get in a DEXA machine. And all of us are pretty comfortable, or I'd say most of us are pretty comfortable sending our kid on a cross-country flight, right? That's just a normal activity. And people don't get those risks. But participating in high school football, that's pretty dangerous, actually. And it's something that most people accept. So we have these diseases that we don't see very much. And so it's hard to really have a gut sense of the risks. You know, Michael talking about his experience with polio epidemics, my personal experience with rubella, or seeing, as a physician, seeing babies die of whooping cough, which I've seen too, changes my perspective on the risk. And so it's hard to think about how you parse through the question of risk.
Thank you. This is a question for the doctors on the panel. What are the more common arguments that you hear against vaccines, and what are your responses to them?
You can go first.
Okay. There's really two different groups that tell me they don't want to vaccinate. There are those who are adamantly opposed, who are concerned about conspiracy, that big pharma is controlling or influencing the CDC and the FDA and the AAP and the CDC and all of those. That's something that I have a harder time addressing. I mean, I know people who are on the advisory committee for immunization practices when new recommendations are made. I've called the National Center for, like when they changed the hepatitis A recommendation, I called the National Center for Hepatologic Research and talked to one of the people who had made the recommendation because I had questions about why they recommended. But I can't convince somebody, about a global conspiracy. The majority of parents who question vaccines are more, they have questions, they have concerns, they're more on the fence than vehemently opposed. They're typically better informed than the parents very often who say, that aren't questioning the vaccines. There are parents, most of the parents will come in and say, This is what we're going to do. Do you have any questions? And they say, well, no, that's what I pay you for, is to make sure, you're supposed, they expect me to be the expert, and if there are questions or concerns, that I would raise them. And so some parents defer to me. The parents who are kind of in the middle are the ones who very often have read so much that they're confused. They're not sure who to believe. They've read this, they've read that. And so those are the ones where we say, well, what are the issues that you've read about? What are the concerns that you have? And a common one is, well, I heard that the mercury in the shots was causing autism. And we go over, how much mercury was in the shots and was taken out of all except some varieties of the flu vaccine in 2001. So since 2001 in my office, we haven't carried any vaccines. Every year we get a little bit of the flu vaccine that does come in the multi-dose vial, but 99% of what we give to the kids is mercury-free. So none of the vaccines that we have for the kids has mercury. Now for some parents, that's really all they wanted to know. Some parents want to know, well, what kind of mercury was it, and did it harm? And so really, it's as individual as anything. What have they read? I could go on for hours because there are so many different specific questions that families have, and I need to make sure that whatever information I'm giving them is answering the question that they have. That which websites have they been on? Which books have they read? And I'm asking not as a judgment against them, just so that we can have an intelligent conversation. Some parents don't want to have an intelligent conversation. They've made up their mind, and nothing I or anyone else says is going to change their mind. That's fine. Then let's not waste our time. But the majority of them, they really want, actually all of them, want to do what's best for their child. They're being their child's advocate. They wouldn't, parents don't come in and say, I want to do something that's going to put my child's life at risk. And that's the perspective I need to go into the exam room with, whether we agree or not. But it's also my job. What they've hired me to do is be their child's advocate and do what I can to keep that child out of harm's way, which includes preventing disease, preventing dangerous accidents, preventing choking and drowning, and all kinds of other things. So it's really where those two clash. Parents being their child's advocate and me being their child's advocate. And when we don't see eye to eye, sometimes we can negotiate that. And sometimes I can give them the information that they need to make an informed decision. The majority of the time when we're done, we are on a path to vaccinating their children. The vast majority of them who come in questioning, in the end, some of them are following their own vaccine schedule, some are following the recommended schedule. And once in a while we have ones who say, no way, I'm never going to do it. And the way the state laws are here, that's their choice, that's their right. So, I don't know, did I address your question well enough?
Yeah, that was great.
Okay.
That was great.
And to be honest, I don't think I have much to add. I would have said
Okay.
the vast majority of what he said. So I won't take other time. Let's have other questions.
Sure. So, I've covered this issue a lot the past few months, as you guys are aware. And something that I've noticed while interviewing parents who are skeptical of vaccines or concerned about vaccines and just listening to testimony at public hearings, I sensed a very deep distrust for the government, public health officials, doctors, the pharmaceutical industry, and I'm curious, what do you consider? This is for everybody. What do you consider to be the role of these experts in, maybe allaying that or building trust, or what do you think could be done about that?
Okay, I'll start. This has been one of the biggest challenges for me in general, thinking about this issue, but certainly this year when it's heated up a fair amount. I'm a scientist by training, right? And I'm a pretty experienced critical thinker. And I know that there's lots of different opinions, and I know that sometimes the medical establishment is wrong. I mean, I think the best example of this is things like the etiology of ulcers, right? I mean, probably when you and I both went to medical school, we thought we were trained that ulcers were caused by overstimulation of the vagus nerve and too much acid secretion in the stomach, and you did things like cut the vagus nerve to feel it. And then some doctors in Australia said, oh no, it's bacteria, and everybody laughed at them for a while. Turns out they're right. But they were other scientists too, so we have to be careful. So not, the mainstream establishment, medical establishment isn't always right. But what worries me a little bit, and what I struggle with too, is the widespread, almost blanket skepticism or disbelief, or cynicism is too strong a word perhaps, but significant suspicion about people who, in my estimation, are really committed to helping other people, and scientists who've published studies really trying to take a hard look at some tough questions. I mean, using big databases, around mercury, for example, thimerosal. And so I don't know, to be honest, I'm not sure I can give you an answer how to get that. I think the real question is trying to understand why people are skeptical about certain kinds of evidence and not skeptical about other kinds of evidence, right? So you may find people, for example, who are very skeptical on the evidence on immunizations and very comfortable with the evidence on climate disruption, right? Or vice versa, very skeptical of climate disruption, perfectly comfortable with immunizations. And so one of the things I think we need to think about is how do we present information in ways that are consistent and comprehensible to people who desire to be well-informed, are intelligent, are well-educated, or desire to be uninformed and aren't super well-educated, but want to be engaged and active participants in their own health, their child's health, and think about how do we present information in consistent ways so that people can be confident about the information no matter what the topic is, that it's presented in ways that make it more trustworthy no matter what the topic.
Yeah, so I think one of the things experts can do is sort of approach this with some humility and admit, as you did, Senator, that experts have been wrong in the past, and understand that those mistakes and in those errors, or those, I don't even want to say mistakes and errors, I want to just say the state of knowledge at the time, they've planted the sort of seeds for doubt that we're seeing bear fruit right now in some of this anti-vaccination sentiment. And I think one of the first things that experts can do is sort of admit, be humble about it, because I think some of the confidence that I think is necessary this is sort of a tricky thing, right? Because as an expert, you have to convey the expertise and the confidence in that. At the same time, you don't want that to be so overwhelming that it puts people off. So I think that that's one of the things that we can do, and to take lay people seriously. I think this is, and we actually heard this really well with what you were talking about, Dr. Rosenblum, and the conversations that you have with your patients, lay people. That's taking them seriously, understanding where they're coming from, and not sort of saying to ourselves, well, this is a conversation that we as experts are going to have, and then we will bestow upon you the knowledge, and you will do as we tell you because we are the experts. I think that may have worked at one point in the past, but we live in an age now where everybody can be an expert, or they can think they can be.
Can I make one comment about that before anybody else says anything? In late February, early March, when things were really at their toughest, on some of the work that I've been doing on a policy side this year, I wasn't sleeping very well. And when my husband would talk to me about why are you not sleeping well, he said, are you upset about what people are saying about you? I said, no, I'm upset. I'm worried that I might be wrong. And I've read almost everything that anybody sent me. Haven't read all the way through Robert Kennedy's book, but I've read parts of it. And I've met with people who disagree with me on a significant way. I've read articles. I've looked at websites to try to glean out where I might be missing something. I've talked to people on both sides of this issue. I have learned more about immunization science in the past 2.5 months than I have my entire career, because I was worried I might be wrong. And I wanted to be sure that I was approaching it with some humility and I wasn't just making an assumption that the vagus nerve was the cause of ulcers and bacteria weren't, but rather that I was looking at as much evidence as possible. So that was what kept me awake at night during all this, not the grumpy stuff from people. It was the worry that I was wrong and that I would be hurting children, which is the last thing in the world I'd ever want to do.
And are you comfortable with what you found?
Yeah, I am.
So I also, it's important that we know what people are reading, what people are saying. I mean, I've read, Dr. Sears' book and Jenny McCarthy's book, and I'm on, the National Vaccine Information Center, which is kind of the national. They're kind of one of the organizers of the Make Vaccines Safer, aka anti-vaccine. You can call, some people call them either one. Red Flags Daily. There's a whole bunch of these that, I try to stay up on what are both sides saying. I also read the journal Vaccine, and the New England Journal of Medicine, and the journal of, JAMA, and but I try to make sure that I'm understanding. I don't just, when they say, oh well, I read Dr. Sears' book and I want to do this alternative schedule. I've read the book. You know what? I don't agree with a lot of what he says, nor do I can give you the long list of experts who don't agree with him. But if that's what parents want to do, I've read the book and I at least understand where they're coming from. But to kind of get back to what your question was, understanding how people think and risk communication and understanding perceived risk and all that. There's a great book by Dan Ariely. He's an economist. Predictably Irrational. Great book, easy read, fascinating.
Yeah.
And what he shows over and over again is that as an economist, he can prove to you how we are all irrational more times a day than we're rational, even though we like to think of ourselves as all being very rational. And you can prove this to yourself the next time you're at, for me, if I'm somewhere and somebody is, they say, well, I'm going to show you the evils of vaccines. Before they even put up the slide, my mind starts to go to, well, where are the holes in their argument? If they're going to put up a quote by Dr. Pollard, the editor of the Vaccine Journal, as to why vaccines are great, before you even see it, you're going to look for how it already supports what you believe. It's called the affect heuristic. It's that we make an emotional decision and then we try and find facts to support us. And this is true no matter what the topic. So it's rarely all the facts added together that make people's decision. They make their decision and then they find ways to support what they've already decided. So we kind of have to depend on those groups like the Institute of Medicine, where they take and they'll convene a panel of scientists and they do a background check to make sure none of them have any ties to industry or that they have any conflicts of interest, and then they will review all of the known literature, a stack this high of journal articles, everything that's ever been published with, about mercury in vaccines and autism, or whatever the issue that they're taking up, and they review everything that's known, and they'll have an epidemiologist from Harvard and a statistician from Columbia, and they put together a panel of national experts to review everything that's known. And I think those are the most dispassionate, the most rational reports. They've gone over. I mean, when they were reviewing the the vaccine safety, they had people like Andrew Wakefield come in and testify, to make sure that they were listening to what those people had to say. And they, his Andrew Wakefield's papers were in the bibliography of things that they reviewed. But it doesn't matter how much data we have. It comes down to that predictably irrational. It comes down to how do people think, how do people make decisions. And honestly, what's happened is in the last 15, 20 years, the medical establishment has stayed stuck in the 1950s in the way that they approach questions like this. And those who are anti-vaccine they're using social media much better. And what they're doing is they're using credible stories. So Jenny McCarthy, who was on Oprah's show several times, wrote her own books, went on the talk circuit. She got a lot of press. And you know what? When you watch her, she's very passionate. She loves her son, Evan. She wouldn't do anything to harm him, and she's looking to save other kids. You know what? That's what people relate to. You put a scientist in front of a TV camera who puts on a white coat and says, last year we had 8 cases of Haemophilus type B influenza meningitis, which were preventable with immunizations, and 3 of those kids were immunocompromised, and blah, 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 blah. There's nothing that people can relate to in that. Mm-hmm. And so we've done a terrible job. Now, how do we do it? How do we take the whole big story and make sure that we're using all of the, because it is more, we can go toe-to-toe, story for story, side against side, and nobody wins. There's a mountain of data that shows what we can prevent. And there are a few stories that say the maybes, maybe it does this, maybe it does that. So you don't want to go toe-to-toe. So it can't be story for story, but then again, you can't use big numbers. Saying that there were 20,000 cases of Haemophilus B, this Hib, there were 20,000 cases of invasive disease before the vaccine. Last year, I think there were 9. We went from 20,000 to 9. That's incredible, but not nearly as moving as if I tell you the story of the one child in Minnesota who got the meningitis and is left with permanent brain damage, is deaf, and whose parents are now caring for this child who is in special ed and really making remarkable progress, but will never be the same. 20,000 isn't compelling, 1 is. And I think that's where we've not done a good service to the stories that we have to tell.
Right, and we talk about effective storytelling all the time, and so maybe we could share some notes on that. So moving on, Bob, you have a book coming out this fall.
I do have a book coming out this
Yeah, we get to talk about your book, about the history of eradication of smallpox. And I'm curious, what you think about the lessons that we as a society learned from that, and how you think that they could be applied today.
For me, the biggest lesson of smallpox is the eradication of smallpox is how inspiring it is. I started by saying that one of the things we can learn from history is from this really remarkable campaign, this great public health victory, and the devotion that it took by the people that were involved in it. But also sort of some of the political factors and contexts that were necessary for that campaign to work, right? It wasn't just a matter of a good vaccine and a good strategy and really hardworking people. It was a matter of that strategy fitting the particular historical context in which it fit, or in which it happened, and understanding how that vaccination campaign so well tapped into that particular historical moment, and how we also, when we're making these arguments about vaccination now, need to understand our political moment, our cultural moment, what this context is that we're working in. That, for me, is the big lesson from smallpox eradication. It was an incredibly inspiring story, and you were talking about stories, right? I guess it doesn't get better than riding an elephant into a part of the Asian subcontinent and delivering vaccine. I mean, these are great stories, and those are in the book. But it's also important to understand that this was a particular, for instance here, a particular moment in post-colonial history where you had to be very sensitive about the appearances of neo-imperialism, right? If you're the WHO and you send in some American doctors, you have to be very careful about what that's going to look like. And I think, so for me, that's the big lesson from the eradication of smallpox.
Cool, thanks. So, Steve, this next one is for you. What can you tell us about what the court system has said about? We've talked a lot about balancing, and can you expand more about what the court system has said about balancing personal beliefs and religious beliefs versus public health when it comes to vaccines?
Sure. Well, actually, as you well know, there have been several Supreme Court cases that have been relatively close on point to these questions, going back to the smallpox epidemic at the turn of the century, previous century. A case went to the United States Supreme Court in 1905, which dealt with the question about whether there could be mandatory vaccination. And the person who objected actually happened to be a Swedish Lutheran minister, I think is what it was, and objected on religious grounds. And went to the court, and the court rather overwhelmingly said that the state had a significant interest in public health and safety in order to override his personal objection to that. There was a case actually in 1922 out of Texas which dealt with the specific issue of vaccination requirement for enrolling children in public schools. And once again, the court said the state has a very significant interest in ensuring that there is eradication of diseases through vaccination, and so consequently upheld the state's interest in these particular cases. This doesn't mean parents don't have any rights or any interests, but when it comes to raising a religious claim, it's actually kind of difficult these days because the courts have said that if it's a law of what we call general applicability, and what that means is it applies across the board, it doesn't single out any group or certainly religion for any disfavored treatment, that the standard of review for a state action is relatively deferential, that the courts will defer to the interests of the state in many of these instances, that the religious claim, because it is no different from any other claim, doesn't get any special significance. And then even if you might want to say that that claim deserves some higher protection, or the deference should be to the religious claim, all courts have said the state still has more than a compelling interest to eradicate diseases such that they can require vaccinations in these instances. Another aspect of this that you have to keep in mind is that states can permissibly accommodate by granting exemptions, religiously based exemptions primarily from vaccinations. And actually 48 states, from what I understand, have some type of exemption for vaccination for children with respect to enrollment in public schools for religious objections. There's 17 other states, not 17 other, not that many states, 17 of those states also have them for philosophical grounds. And so there has been a fairly widespread practice of giving some type of limited exemptions. But I think what people need to understand is because of the state of the law, those are by state largesse. And kind of going back to some of the comments you were making, I think that's part of the dynamic that's at stake here. Is it kind of, I think it just bothers people to think that, wait, my constitutionally protected right to be a parent is minimized, and if I am going to get an exemption from the law because of my religious beliefs, it's at the state's decision to give me this exemption. I can't demand this exemption. Now, most states, once again, like I said, give these exemptions. But they don't have to give these exemptions. I think that becomes what's difficult in this debate for many people to understand. And consequently, the state needs to be balancing its significant interests. One interest we have not talked about that much, when it comes at least to the law in this question about providing permissive accommodations for people's religious beliefs. Even though the courts have said the government can provide in many instances these types of accommodations, an additional factor has to be taken into consideration in addition to the state's health safety interests. And that is the impact of that accommodation on innocent third parties. And with respect to the specific issue of vaccination or other types of questions raising children, there are innocent third parties. And those may be the children of the parents themselves, who, by virtue of the failure of vaccination, may in fact incur some future disease that can have a significant consequence. This was back before they had the vaccination for this, but my mother had chickenpox, and so I remember having shingles, a very painful disease. But if you would not vaccinate your child for that, then that would be the legacy, the potential legacy of the child sometimes when they become an adult. And so it's all right for the government to accommodate your religious practice, but once that accommodation starts transferring the burdens of that accommodation onto innocent third parties, not just particularly the children of the objectors, but potentially to children who may also be in public schools, then that becomes an additional formula in the mix. So once again, the state can do it, but the state actually has the authority to withdraw those or at least limit those, and it's said within their authority. And so I think that becomes part of the debate. I mean, the concern that many people have in this debate, that it seems like I have very little control over this.
If I could just piggyback on that.
Sure.
Just another sort of lesson or something that I get from smallpox eradication related to what you were saying, Dr. Rosenblum, about want to do what's best for your kid. There's also, as you were talking about, Steve, what's best for other kids too.
Mm-hmm.
And that's remarkable for me from smallpox eradication. It wasn't done to protect solely my kid. It was done to protect all of those other kids. I mean, and this real sense of responsibility to your own children, but your responsibility as a citizen, your responsibility to other people's children as well. That's something that I think is remarkable, and I think is actually remarkably missing from the conversations that we have now is, yes, this is for your kid, but it's also for other kids too. You know, whether that argument gets traction in the society we live in now, that's maybe a bigger debate for another forum. But
Well, some of that is so much of what the public perceives is what the media covers. So, you know, it's that immediacy. It's what stories have you heard recently that seem more important. And you know, if the patient of mine who's 7 years old who had a liver transplant who can't get vaccinated against measles, if she gets measles and it's in the media, it will change people's perspective on how important is it to protect others. There haven't been a lot of those stories out there. You know, 3 years ago, the outbreak of whooping cough down in California, and the 10 babies who died, most of whom were too young to have been vaccinated. That really stuck with people. But it's the immediacy. You know, there haven't been a lot of those stories of the people immune compromised or too young or too old, or that community that we're protecting.
And that is a great segue to our final question, and it's about the media. Senator Steiner Hayward, around the same time that you were losing sleep over this, so was I, because I was like, I don't know if I'm covering this right. And I had a lot of conversations with my editor about this. And so what I want to know from everyone here is, what are your thoughts on, how the media have been covering this issue, and what are some tips that you might have for journalists who may not have a science background and may have been taught to talk to all sides of the issue, but also, we also want to avoid false balance and it's complicated. It's been a little tricky, and so I'm curious, what you guys have to say about that.
Uh-oh, they're looking at me. It's interesting you brought this question of false balance because it's a concern of mine, actually not so much on this issue, but on other topics in general, that you have to give
Climate
equal
change.
credence to both. So I think that's an issue. I don't think that's happened as much, and I actually think in this case, the mainstream media have been pretty reasonable about reaching out to people who have different perspectives, talking about their objections, but also talking to the scientists and the policymakers and the people like Professor Green who think about things like constitutional protections. The bigger challenge, I think, honestly, is something that not an individual journalist like you probably can't address, which is to say it has to do with this affect heuristic, is that what you called it? I can never remember what the term is, which is to say that I think we're seeing much more of a split in the media, and that you get some who are always reporting from one perspective, doesn't matter the issue, pick an issue, and some that are reporting from another perspective. And one of the challenges I think that faces us going forward is how do we begin to draw the media reporting more back toward the center, which I think will help draw all of our conversations more back toward the center, which will be good for us in a whole host of areas, and improve the level of civil discourse around a range of controversial topics. So that's frankly, my biggest concern, that there's a lot of sound and light, sound and fury signifying nothing, to quote Shakespeare, on this and many other issues. And I worry, and it's on both sides of the issue, right? I mean, you see articles that are absolutely adamant that anybody who chooses not to immunize their child is an idiot and a fool. I'm not saying that, and neither is Dr. Rosenblum, and neither is anybody else sitting here. And then you see a lot of other people who say anybody who does immunize their child ought to be prosecuted for child abuse, essentially, because they're not acting in their child's best interest. I don't think either of those is helpful to the conversation. So anything that the media can do to have reasonable conversations with people who are coming from multiple perspectives and present those in reasonable ways, that helps.
So I would just, my bit of advice or thought about this is remember which media you are. Social media is where everybody gets to talk about anything they want. And I think that the news media is in a position to make some judgments about what gets the exposure. Because, all the theories are going to get floated. They're going to be out there, thanks to social media. But there's a bit of respect that I think is accorded, rightfully so, to the news media, and that comes with a responsibility to, and to remember that there are some theories that are just so crackpot that we'll leave them on Twitter, and that's fine.
Do you guys?
I appreciate that as a journalist, that you recognize that that false balance, that sometimes it's a false dichotomy, interview one pro, one con, then you've given a balanced approach to something that is that really the amount of information that's out there is overwhelmingly in one direction or the other. And once in a while we do see articles like that, or news interviews, or it's. But I think it's really important to, and a very difficult hurdle is for a journalist to become educated enough in topic after topic after topic. I mean, I have a PhD in molecular and cell biology and an MD, and for fun I read the journal Vaccine. How do you in less than a day grasp that? And so I appreciate what a challenge that is for the media. And those articles that are covered in in a disingenuous, false, even-handed way, I know that was the fastest way to get the article out. But that's why I will use social media to share. I mean, my office, we have Facebook, Twitter. We have, we even have a Pinterest, and it's so that we can take those things that when we read the ones that we say, this was really well done, we can just say, we thought this was interesting. It's not, we don't use it, we're not writing a lot of it. I mean, yes, we have a blog, but most of it is saying, this was well done, this was interesting, this was something that we thought was worthy of passing along. So we will use the social media when we find those that we like.
Great. Well, we do have to wrap up the discussion portion because we promised everyone a chance to ask questions. So I think, can we put the second mic over there? So if you have questions, just line up behind one of the mics, and please just keep it concise and no speeches, but anything goes. So.
I'm just going to wait a second while people sort of settle down and move. Or do you want me to go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I have a question about the vaccine court and the VAERS system. So the vaccine court was established in 1986. It's a federally mandated program where people can apply for adjudication and money based on vaccine injury. There have been 3,190 adjudicated cases costing the government $3 billion in the last 30 years. There have been tens of thousands of VAERS reported cases of adverse reaction to vaccines. How do you as a panel reconcile all of those injuries, disabilitating, and I know of one case at least in death, with mandating vaccines to all children?
Okay. So there are two different pieces to that. One is the vaccine adverse events reporting system. And it is a reporting system that anybody who thinks that anybody has had an injury due to vaccines, we ask them to report that. I have the 1-800 number in my phone, and I've given it to parents a number of times. And part of that is looking for the needle in the haystack. So if you look at a bunch of kids who didn't have a vaccine in the last month, how many of them had fevers and vomiting, and how many of them, I had one patient this last week who had her first epileptic seizure. So then you look at kids who've had their vaccines, and if one of them has a seizure, is the seizure going to be more likely after a vaccine or not? So we ask people that if their kids have had a vaccine recently, and it's parents, teachers, anybody, and they have had what they consider an adverse reaction, we ask them to report it. Because there are those rare things where, if you study the vaccine in 10,000 kids, you might not see it. Maybe when it's in 100,000 or 1,000,000 kids, you start to see there is a pattern. There is a slight increase. Maybe it's a 1 in 1,000,000 increase, but some of these are real. We'll only know that when we get the reporting. However, in order to get those little epidemiologic blips that are real, you get a lot of coincidences. So, I know somebody who's in their 80s who had their first heart attack the week after they got their flu shot. It was actually the day after they got a flu shot. And they said, I think that flu shot gave me the heart attack. Well, you can ask enough people and you'll find other people who had their heart attack the day or the week after their flu shot. So you need then to look at, so those bring up good questions. So then you need to look at large populations and say, what is the rate of heart attacks or strokes in people who've had a flu shot versus those who haven't? And look, year after year, is there an increase in one year versus another? And it actually turns out that the risk of heart attack and stroke is slightly lower in years that people have had their flu vaccine. getting the flu causes a lot of inflammation, and you're more likely to. But the guy who had his heart attack the day after his flu shot, he's convinced it was the shot. But when you look at thousands and 10,000s and hundreds of thousands of people, so we need those reporting systems to find those things. And so the vaccine adverse events reporting system, anybody can call. You know, on your way home tonight, you can all call and report that the last time you got your whatever shot, that you had whatever. And so you know, it's unfiltered, right? And so it's a lot of reports, and it's useful information, but it isn't pure. So what happened was, in the United States, we had many vaccine manufacturers who said, you know, given the legal system here, the risk of being sued is so great that we're done. And so there was through the medical legal system, they were looking for, how do we make it so that we can have companies that are still comfortable making vaccines in this country without worrying that every single time a kid gets a fever, they're going to sue, or every time a kid who's going to have epilepsy anyway, you know, develops epilepsy. You know, it's how do we make sure that we protect them so that they don't go out of business, but at the same time, if a child is potentially harmed from a vaccine, because everything has risks. Drive to Safeway, 1 in 2 million chance you're going to die. You know, that is, you know, there are risks with everything. 200 people a year die in this country from accidents in the shower. You know, so there are risks. There are people who will have an allergic reaction to a vaccine. A lot of and if you read all the reports that come out of the injury court, some of them are known side effects of the vaccines. Some of them are possible. So if a patient comes into my clinic, they get their measles shot, they go out, on the way to the car they're stung by a bee. 20 minutes later they have an anaphylactic reaction and end up in the ER with whatever. If they go to the vaccine court, they will be awarded financial restitution because it is biologically plausible their anaphylaxis could have been from the vaccine. And so they don't have to prove. So anything that's possible, there can be compensation. So it's not every one of those cases is saying that the vaccine did cause this. It's that it may have, and very often. So I'm not saying that the vaccines don't have risks. They do. But not every time that the court has paid out has it meant that the injury was caused by the vaccine.
Could I add one comment to that?
Yes, please.
Any child getting hurt is bad, right? Let's just start with that premise. But as Dr. Rosenblum just said, anything you do has risk. And this kind of gets back to my point about risk assessment. If you take those little over 3,000 cases from the vaccine court, and then you think about, well, how many children have been getting vaccines during that period, and what does that really represent? So right now in Oregon, our birth rate is about 45,000 per year, right? So let's just go back to when we were a little bit less populated and even say it's 30,000 a year averaged over that period of time. That's about 900,000 babies born in this state, most of whom got virtually all of the recommended immunizations. So that means that we have about, I don't know, 100 million, not 100 million, 10 million vaccination episodes in Oregon alone. And we're not a huge state. So given all that, when we start to look at risk assessment, that number, when you put it in the context of that many people nationwide getting immunizations, as I said, I don't like any kid getting hurt. Don't get me wrong. But during that period of time, we've lost more babies to whooping cough than we've had adjudicated cases in the vaccine court. So putting that in perspective, I think is important. I don't like kids getting hurt, but I also think this kind of gets back to my point about risk assessment that I made earlier.
I would, so the question was about how do you reconcile the fact that there are some cases of side effects and reactions from vaccines and the fact that requiring a higher level of vaccination is good. I think those things are kind of easy to reconcile. Yes, there are side effects in limited cases to some vaccines in some cases, but if you use that as the excuse to stop vaccinating or even reduce vaccinations, then it doesn't work anymore, and you put the public health at risk. I mean, it's in some ways sort of that's how I reconcile those things. Yes, it is a fact that there are cases of side effects from these vaccines. If you take those vaccines away, you're endangering the public health, and the calculation for me isn't too hard to get, it doesn't take me too much to get from A to B on that one.
Can I just, so there are 3 vaccine stories that are important to understand that the system is listening. So when I started in practice, they were still using the oral polio vaccine. Every year there were a few kids who were born with an immunodeficiency that wasn't, that there was no, you didn't look at them, you didn't see it, you didn't know. But when they got this weakened polio virus, they would get a mild case of polio. When they looked at the data, and around the world, the oral is still the main one that's used. It's cheaper, it's easier, and it actually gives you community-wide immunity because it's passed through the body, and then you contaminate other people with the vaccine strain. In this country, we looked and said, at the cost of millions of dollars, we can have a few kids who get this mild case of polio, or we could go to the more expensive one, and the risk is 0 of giving kids polio. We're going with the more expensive one. We're going with the one that's more of a problem because we can reduce that risk. Even though the risk is tiny, we can reduce it. Then we did a similar type thing with the whooping cough vaccine. It used to be made with the entire cell of the bacteria. We were able to clone the genes from the surface, use something that was more expensive, more difficult to manufacture, but fewer side effects. The kids who had the fevers of 104 and had febrile seizures after their DPT vaccines, those became a thing of the past. Now, some kids do get fevers, but it's more like 101, 102, much less likely to see the febrile convulsions, those types of things. So it's safer, more expensive, but it was important that we do whatever we can to reduce the risks. And the third one was the rotavirus vaccine. There was a vaccine that came out. It was about a 1 in a million chance that kids would get an intestinal folding that, in theory, could have, if enough kids get that, some child could die from it. And that was actually reporting to the VAERS system that said, hey, we've seen a slight increase in the reports of this condition. Take a look at the data. They pulled that vaccine from the market, started over, and made the vaccine in a different way. And so for a number of years, the vaccine wasn't available at all, which in this country, because we have hospitals, there weren't a lot of kids dying. There were thousands and thousands of hospitalizations from the disease, but we weren't preventing a lot of deaths. But around the world, there are millions of kids that die from diarrheal disease, a lot of which is this one disease. But if it wasn't safe enough for us to use it, nobody else in the world was going to use it. And it would have theoretically, maybe 1 in a million kids would have gotten this one condition, and I don't know what the rate of, how many millions it would take before a child died from a side effect of the vaccine, but it was theoretically possible versus thousands of kids dying from the disease, and yet we said, pull it off the market. Now, in a sheer numbers and risk calculation, that doesn't add up. But we have to have people's confidence in what we're doing, and we can't, it's the omission versus commission. We can't be doing something that's harming them if we know that there's something safer. Sorry.
Hi, first, thank you all for being here. But I am one of those anti-vax parents. I'm proud of it. But There's a lot that I would like to talk about, but I won't take up everybody's time. But having my wife as a registered nurse, we come from a medical, scientific, as well as me being a law student, legal background as to why we've made the decision for our children. Well, son, second one to be born this summer. But I wanted to ask specifically with the bill, the new bill that you've proposed, Senator. And that's, you have focused on the 7%, which I know where the 7% comes from. I mean, I do my analysis and do my research. But what I don't understand is, you have to, I assume that you're trying to say that if we reduce the exemption rate, that will cause an increase in the vaccination rate across the state. And if that is the, cursory or circular logic, it's flawed, because what do you say about the state of West Virginia, which is one of the two that does not allow non-medical exemptions, and they have one of the lowest vaccination rates in the country?
By the way, there are 2 mics, and so you guys can form 2 lines if you want. But anyway.
So there are actually multiple parts to that question, and I want to start with the last part. West Virginia in 2-year-olds does have a very low rate of immunization, but that's because there's a real problem with access. By the time kids get to kindergarten, their immunization rate is actually quite high, and certainly by the end of 1st grade, they're close to 100%. And in Mississippi, which is the other state that doesn't have any non-medical exemptions, they're about 99.7% immunization rate, and that 0.3% is about what we would expect for kids who have medical issues that prohibit them from getting immunizations or are living with a family member where it would be dangerous for the kid to get immunized. Let me just clarify where we are with this bill right now, because there's been it's been evolving. And I will say, I want to be crystal clear about this. I have changed my position on what the bill should be based on new information, all right? Not based on anything else, based on the fact that we just finally, late last week, got preliminary data back from the health authority on the change in non-medical exemptions in the 2014-15 school year. It looks as if, based on the work that we did in the 2013 session, that Dr. Rosenblum gets a lot of credit for in designing the video and things like that, that we've dropped our non-medical exemption rate by about 20%, which means we're going from about 8% to about 6 and a little %, which is great. That's good progress. That means we don't need to change the process right now, and we're not going to, all right? There will still be an opportunity for people to choose to take a non-medical exemption. The state will still allow it. You can still do it either by talking to your child's primary care provider or watching a video. The only thing that's going to be new is a requirement that schools notify parents about immunization rates at that school. And Senator Knopp, a Republican from Bend who's concerned about this issue, brought up a point at a hearing last week. He said, well, if a kid's missing one of the required immunizations and exempts out from that one, does that count as a full non-medical exemption? Currently, the answer to that is yes, so we're going to break it out by disease. Because frankly, if I were choosing not to immunize, or if my child were medically unable to get certain immunizations, I don't really care if the other kids are immunized against tetanus or not. That's not going to protect my child. I do care a lot about what the immunization rate is against measles, right? Because that's very, very contagious and would be very dangerous to my child if my child were immunocompromised. So we think it's important that parents who are unable to vaccinate their children, or where the parents themselves are undergoing chemotherapy and are therefore more at risk, or perhaps have an elderly parent who's more at risk and they have to decide whether they're going to bring grandma to the school play, should have the right to have that information so they can make a choice too. And if they have a child who's really at risk, they should have the choice of being able to go to a different school to protect their child's health, just as parents in this state have the right to choose not to immunize their child. So the only change at this point is going to be to publish, have each school by school give parents detailed information in ways that will completely protect confidentiality. There'll be aggregate data. They won't break it out by grade level. They won't do anything else. They'll just say in our entire K through 5 or K through 8 school, here's what our immunization rate is against measles. Here's what it is against diphtheria, which is also a really scary disease that we don't see anymore. And that's to give parents who are unable to immunize their children some choice as well. And that's all we're doing.
Hello. I'd like to start real quick by thanking you guys for being here. This can kind of devolve into a pretty heated debate, so putting yourself in this position is not easy. Thank you. To get my bias out of the way, I am pro-vaccine. The question I have for you is I feel that this conversation is not really about vaccines anymore because the science really has been pretty definitive. At this point, it's more about bias or cognitive bias and how we approach those on a personal level, especially you as a doctor. The question I wanted to ask for you, Dr. Rosenblum, was, that is your name, right? I'm sorry. I wanted to ask you, when you sit down with parents, how do you confront those biases that they bring into the clinic? Especially, I hate public speaking, I'm sorry. How do you confront those biases? How do you confront people who walk in with they've already made the decision before they entered the room? And what do you recommend for other people in this debate as far as respecting other people's opinions, but at the same time trying to get people to confront those pre-held beliefs that they refuse to let go of?
So, you know, one of the most important things to start with is understanding what are their sources of information, and one of the key pieces there is who do they trust? Because trust is, I mean, you can go on the internet and read anything. Anything. I mean, there's all kinds of, there's a doctor, an MD, who will come and testify for you for a price. If you're accused of child abuse and shaken baby syndrome is actually caused by the DPT vaccine, and he'll come and testify on your behalf if you need that. I mean, you can find anything on the internet. But what are the sources? Who do you trust? So very often when I'm having this conversation to start with the parents, you know, very often these are new parents into my practice. You know, they've had a new baby. I don't have a long track record with them. What are my motivations? Am I on the Speaker's Bureau for a pharmaceutical industry? You know, am I being paid? Do I get a cut? You know, are we you know, do we drive a fancy car because you know, of all the money we make from vaccines? You know, there are questions about my credibility. And so that's part of why it's important that when parents say they don't want to vaccinate their child, that I not then say my way or the highway. Because what's that going to do? I mean, they didn't trust me to begin with. They're going to go find somebody who already believes the way they believe. I want to share with them what I know. I want to share with them, you know, the information that I have, the things that I've read, the national and international thought leaders. And so I do keep them around. And over time, they do learn. They get to know me. And they see that really my number one concern is their child's well-being. And so it's really more about the trust than it is about the bias. It's about, you know, so much of it is which sources, which are the sources, because they're inundated with sources. And if you get all your vaccine information from the blog site Age of Autism, you won't believe anything I say, ever. If you have an open mind and in time you get to know that it's your child that I'm trying to protect. You know, I drive a Camry. You know, Merck didn't send me here. You know, I am not an automaton of the big pharma. And I think it takes time for me to develop that with the families.
Good evening. Thank you again for your time this evening. So to Dr. Green's point that nothing is absolute, that certainly applies to science as well. I do get frustrated in articles I read sometimes that implies that the science is settled, or the questions of whether or not vaccines are related to the autism epidemic has been settled, and the science is settled on that, because nothing is absolute. And to Senator Steiner Hayward's point, you know, science evolves, and so do our scientific findings. So my question for you as a panel is, how advanced is the understanding in the science community of the complexity of the human immune system? So what I mean to ask is, what do we understand about how the immune system works? What hasn't been addressed tonight, and what I find concerning, and I think many parents do, is that there's a widening gap between vaccine successes, which we've been pointed out many times this evening, the eradication and diminishing of certain infectious diseases. But there's also a large increase in chronic disease and immune system disorders. The explosion of the autoimmune diseases. 15 million children now have severe food allergies. Those food allergies cause 200 deaths a year. So my question is, as we see infectious disease diminish, and people aren't as worried about that, we see chronic disease rising in ourselves and in our loved ones, and the relationship between what we're doing to our immune systems with the 49 vaccines before age 6, how does that affect it? And to summarize the question and not go any further, what is the understanding of the immune system?
Well, the understanding of the immune system goes back, it's something that I can't quantify the understanding of the immune system.
I'm sorry, let me clarify. So I guess to be more specific for you, the cause of autoimmune disease. So in many adults and children, we've seen a significant rise in autoimmune disease.
Right.
And from what I've researched, they can't point to why those autoimmune diseases are rising, yet scientific community feels confident that an infant's immune system can handle the hepatitis B vaccine within 12 hours of birth and another onslaught of 49 doses of vaccines before the age of 6.
Okay, so what we know is that if you look at the immune system and what it's able to handle, when a baby comes out, it's sterile. No bacteria, no viruses, no fungus. If it has that inside the womb, usually it's bad news for the developing fetus. So when they come out, they are colonized. Within days, there are millions and billions of bacteria. If you look at how many challenges there are for their immune system, how many different things does their immune system react to? It's between 2,000 and 6,000 different immune reactive agents a day. Then you say, okay, well, if you have between 2,000 and 6,000 things a day that your body is reacting to, then you want to say, well, how much is in that vaccine? Well, in a hepatitis B vaccine, there's one type of an antigen. There's only one thing that we're asking the immune system to do. And so then your question is, we can't track the exact travel of every stage, but what we want to know is there an increase in autoimmune diseases in kids who've had their hepatitis B versus those who haven't? And the answer is no, there is not. And it actually takes looking back over long periods of time to be able to answer that, because autoimmune diseases will often show up years or decades later. So the answer to the hepatitis B causing any type of an autoimmune disorder, they have looked and looked and looked, and in tens of millions of people who've had the vaccine, there is no rise in autoimmune diseases.
Well, in order to determine that.
Let me finish. What the theory that's showing with increase in allergy and autoimmune diseases, the thing that seems to be most closely linked is the hygiene hypothesis. So it's that kids who are raised on a farm have lower allergies. There was a study last week that showed that families that hand wash their dishes versus dishwasher wash them have lower rates of food allergies. That we had been telling families for a while to delay introducing things like nuts and shellfish until we were able to see that delaying introduction of those foods, actually you don't build up a tolerance for those foods, and you're more likely, slightly more likely, but more likely to develop a food allergy. So that's, do we know it's not the vaccines? Yes, because if you use something like the Vaccine Safety Data Link that has 9 million lives in it. And so you're looking for what is the rate of autoimmune disease in hundreds of thousands of people who got a vaccine versus those who didn't, and the rate is the same.
We do have to move on.
Thank
So
you.
we have time for one more question. So
I
I'd like to thank the panel for all being here this evening as well. I have a follow-up question to the doctors with regard to statements that were made about the VAERS system. VAERS was put in place in 1991, and I did a search of the database for Oregon, limiting it strictly to reported cases that had a serious consequence or a serious adverse reaction. And everybody recognizes the limitations of the voluntary system. In fact, the CDC recognizes that one of the limitations of it is probably grossly underreported by as much as a factor of 10. And researching all of the reported cases in Oregon since 1991, I came up with 240 serious cases and 63 reported deaths reported to the system. Now, taking the figures that Senator Steiner-Hayward gave in terms of the number of births that were used, I actually used a higher figure. I think the last 2 years of birth rate in Oregon was 51,000 people, because I checked with the OHA before I did my analysis on this. But crunching the numbers and assuming that we had a birth rate of 51,000 back to 1991, we're looking at a serious adverse reaction to vaccines at a factor of 1 in every 4,500 children that's vaccinated. That's far more significant than the 1 in a million serious adverse consequences that the CDC tells us and doctors tell us when we bring our children in to be vaccinated. How can you explain the discrepancy between what the data shows in terms of how serious or how frequently there are serious consequences and what we're told in terms of how minimal the risk is from the vaccines?
You can start and I'll chip in if you want. It's up to you.
The only way we can, everybody wants perfect data. We can put everybody in a lab and measure before and after, do double-blind, placebo-controlled. It's unethical to have children live out their lives, or it's actually even unethical to take a huge cohort and vaccinate some of them and give others placebo, knowing what we know about what the vaccines prevent. Now, there are observational studies that will look at these questions, those kids who've been vaccinated versus those who haven't, and what are the disease occurrences, and that's, it's observational. As far as the VAERS system, it is what it is. It is an imperfect way to look for increased incidence of disease. Now, there was somebody who reported to VAERS that their vaccine caused them to turn into the Incredible Hulk. And so anybody can report anything. So you can say that things are underreported, things are overreported. VAERS is not built to tell us what is the incidence of adverse events. It's looking for those temporal correlations. Because you know what, you can look, you can find anything in the data. Everybody can crunch the numbers and come up with whatever they want. When people tell me, oh, look, we've given more shots and we see more of this disease. We see more autoimmunity and we're giving more shots. The same thing is true of the rate of auto accidents in people using Proactiv. The more pimples you have, the more likely you are to crash. So, just because things are correlated doesn't mean it's cause and effect. And so we need to ask those questions, though. When people say, I'm concerned that the vaccine is causing autoimmunity, we need to look at that. We need those, it raises good questions. But just because you've seen a correlation in timing it doesn't mean that it's cause and effect. It doesn't mean that we should leave the population at risk of disease. It doesn't mean that we should throw out the baby with the bathwater. We need to actually look and see what is the real incidence. And VAERS just isn't made to do that. It's not what it was designed for.
Thank you. Audience, thank you for your attention and your excellent questions. And I want to thank Steve for adding a great deal to our presentation. And Bob, same with you. Jay, thank you so much. Senator, thank you so much. And thank you, audience.